Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back. So, gaming in 2024 on a Windows computer. 16 gigs, 32 gigs. What do you think? I'm feeling more like 64 gigs, to be honest with you. 16 gigs, I'm going to tell you right now, is an absolute and utter joke. Okay? Whether you're running Windows 10 or Windows 11, makes no difference. Okay? 16 gigs is not going to cut it for you. Especially if you're into mid-level or high-end gaming, you are just you're just defeating the whole purpose of life if you're just stuck in 16 gigs of RAM. Okay, even 24 gigs, okay, 32 gigs, and just barely making the grade for heavy-duty gaming, barely. Now you need more than RAM, obviously. You do need, a good graphics card with 8 or 12 gigs of video RAM preferred, especially for some of the AAA games nowadays. Okay? Medium games, you're usually okay. 4 gigs, 8 gigs, not a big whoop, right? But the whole 16 gig of RAM thing is absolutely pointless. Now, I'm running Windows 11, and just to get to the desktop here is about 8.7 gigs worth of my RAM. Now, I do have 64 gigs of RAM on my computer, and I'm going to explain a little bit about that. But let's do some math here, okay? If you have a game like, for example, Cyberpunk. Now, I'm going to tell you right now on low graphics settings, it's horrible, okay? But it is kind of playable, right? Medium graphics are a lot better. And medium to high, it ain't worth writing home about, but going to ultra, yeah. All right, but ultra, you better have a real demanding computer and a lot of RAM, a lot of video power, okay, and you definitely have to have an NVMe. Now, I do have an NVMe in my laptop. I have an Asus F17 gamer system. It is a i7. Let me read you my specs here. I have an i7 11800H 2.3 gigahertz base clock. Now, it's an 8-core processor, all performance cores, and it overclocks to about 4.6 gigahertz on the full turbo. I leave mine in performance mode all the time, so I'm always running at about 3.6 gigahertz, okay? Now, being that I have 64 gigs of RAM in this thing, just to launch one tab with Chrome, I'm already at 9 gigs of RAM, okay? Now, let's forget Chrome right now, but now my video card is an RTX 3050, not the TI, just a regular 3050, with GDDR6 RAM, and it's 4 gigs of video. And I do have Intel graphics built into my laptop as well, so it's dual. But I chose to set up the computer so that no matter what, it's just going to use the NVIDIA graphic card. That's it for everything, okay? Which is better that way, all right? Now, being that as it is, 64 gigs of RAM is a lot of RAM in a computer, and it's a good thing to have. If you can jam 64 gigs in, that's better than 16 by far, because 16 is pointless. And of course, 32 gigs is really pushing your luck. Okay, now Cyberpunk is one of the most demanding games out there, but it is not the most demanding game when it comes to RAM. But if you are looking at, you have a really super raunchy computer, and they all come with usually 16 gigs of RAM anyways, even the raunchy systems. Let's do a little bit of math, shall we? Okay, so I'm losing 8.7 gigs to the OS. Now, what you're not being told by every video channel out there is the simple fact that Windows does not release the RAM to you just because you run a game. You add to the RAM usage above what Windows wants, okay? And Windows, whether it's running 16 gigs of RAM or 32 or 64, it wants 8.7 gigs out of me, okay? So, let's say you are able to run Cyberpunk 2077 at full ultra settings. That's going to get you about 60 frames per second with a Core i9 or Ryzen 9. You're going to need an RTX 3080 or a Radeon RX 7900 XTX with 12 gigs of video RAM on it. Okay, this is without using system RAM. Okay, you're going to need 20 gigs of system RAM for this thing. Okay, now, so if you add on the 20, so plus 20 gigs of system RAM, okay? That gives you 28.7 gigs. If all you have is 16 gigs of RAM in your computer, you're not even cutting it, okay? Now, let's go back again. 8.7 gigs. System RAM for the OS gets you to the desktop. That's all it does for you, okay? Now let's say you're going to go into the high settings. Well, it wants 8 gigs of video RAM, okay? Now, if you've got that, great. And if you've got the required processor and one of the corresponding video cards, there's 3 choices, great, okay? But it wants 16 gigs of system RAM, okay? So plus 16 gigs of system RAM. That's 24.7 gigs. Here's where you're going to run into a bit of a hiccup, okay? And this is on high settings. You can still expect to get 60 frames per second at a 1080p. You'll notice on all the specs it all talks 1080p and it all talks about Windows 10 64-bit. They don't mention any other resolution here other than the ultra setting. They do say 2160p on ray tracing overdrive or regular ultra 2160p. Everything else is 1080p with 60 frames or 30 frames per second. Okay. Now I have run ray tracing on mine. Okay. I have more than enough system RAM. I've got more than a powerful enough drive because it is NVMe. Okay. But they're talking ray tracing low setting 1080p 30 frames per second. Core i7 9700, Ryzen 5 5600, RTX 2060 or Radeon RTX 6800 XT or an ARC A750, okay? 8 gigs of video RAM still required to get 30 frames per second. Now, I'm going to call the creator of the program a little bit of a liar here. I'm running the original release of Cyberpunk 2077. I have 64 gigs of RAM. I have 4 gigabytes of video RAM, okay? Now, my processor, of course, is right up there. I have no problem there either. What I am lacking, though, is the 8 gigs of video RAM. I'm even lacking 6 gigs for minimum setting to get 30 gigs. I should not, or 30 frames per second. I should not even see 60 frames per second. However, with my computer and its configuration, and my video card is 4 gigs, it steals the extra video RAM it needs to at least get to 8 or more gigs of video power. Mind you, the system RAM is slower than the video RAM, so it does slow down the video card a bit to match it so that they don't collide and crash and give me blue screen of death, okay? And I play this game quite a bit, and I've never once had an issue anywhere, okay? I am averaging in outdoor environments 70 plus frames per second. Okay, indoor environments like a really super crowded bar, okay, where I'm sitting in a scenery right now, I'm getting into the 50s, okay. Now that's medium settings, that's a quick setting of medium setting, okay, so quick select, and that is at 1080p is what I get. Now, if I go to high, then I lose a couple of FPS, but I'm still doing really good, indoors and outdoors, I'm doing pretty good. If I go to ultra, I get knocked down to 40s, okay? Now, the original first release is probably not near as demanding as the newest release, but I can't even find the original release specs. I'm gonna have to do some more searching on the net. But the game does nonetheless want anywhere between 12 upwards to 20 gigs, and if all you have is 16 gigs of RAM, it's a joke. Because even at 12 gigs of RAM for the low setting here, okay, it wants 6 gigs of video. It wants 12 gigs of RAM. Now, like I said, I have tons of RAM here. It's not an issue, okay? I'm just lacking that even extra 2 gigs of video RAM to be on low. But I'm not playing low. I'm playing medium. Okay, sometimes I'll even play high because I still have enough playable FPS, but medium to high settings graphically, there's not much graphically to write home about. But when you hit ultra, now that's something to write home about. That's some amazing graphics. But the game is not quite as playable on ultra on my particular laptop, okay? I could definitely use a more powerful laptop, but not quite yet. Anyways, I almost did it, but I changed my mind. So you can see yourself and do the math yourself. that when you launch your monitor program, whatever it is that tells you how much RAM your computer is using, you're going to see how much Windows is using, and then you can compare that to the specs of the game, okay? And you also got to realize that anytime you launch a game, a video editor, a browser, it doesn't matter what program it is, you don't get back that used system RAM for your OS. You always add on. That's the way computers work. They don't give anything back, okay? Now, there is one exception to that in the gaming world, and that's on the Mac OS Sonoma. It has what's called gamer mode, and what that does is it shuts down a crap load of stuff, and it releases near 3 gigabytes of RAM back to the computer so you can have that RAM available for your gaming, especially if you don't have a ton of RAM in your computer. Okay, now this can work out rather well for some games, okay? Because even Minecraft does chew a fair chunk of RAM, okay? Unfortunately, Minecraft does not like the MacBook Air M1 because it runs it really super hot. Now, at least it doesn't fart or stall out on me. It hasn't crashed my M1, but it did actually do a power crash shutdown on my 2015 Air, which has plenty of RAM in it and everything, and gamer mode is in effect with even 8 gigs of RAM, and I still am not into virtual swap. But, you know, and that's the other thing, with 16 gigs of RAM, you're going to hit swap. Okay, now the problem with the Mac OS though is when you quit that game and you will go back to the desktop, that RAM that they, you know, gave you back, it's still there, right? So your OS is now using like 3 gigs of RAM instead of 5.5 to 6 gigs of RAM, right? So some of your programs may not function or function properly until you restart the computer so they can turn all that crap back on for you. So that is one drawback to the Mac OS releasing RAM for gameplay. But in Windows, you don't get any of that in Windows 11. You don't get it in Windows 10. You don't get it in any Windows OS where it actually would give you back some RAM to play your games when you have a lower RAM system. You're stuck, okay? And we've done the math. You've seen it for yourself, okay? It adds and adds and adds, okay? It doesn't give back. So anybody who tells you that even 16 gigs of RAM is good for medium to high level gaming, well, they don't know what they're talking about, I'm sorry, okay? And 32 gigs of RAM is kind of borderline for mid-level to AAA. And there are AAA games far more demanding for even RAM in itself than what Cyberpunk wants, so think of it that way. Right? There are video editing programs for Mac and PC that want 16 gigs of RAM just to fire up the damn editor. You haven't even dropped any files in there yet, which will create more RAM requirement of the program above what it uses just to fire up. These specs are based on firing up the game. Okay, they could still use a little bit more RAM, and they can, especially when you get more demanding on how you want the game to be playable, right? So that's another thing. You're not going to save any RAM by lowering specs, really. You don't save RAM, okay? But you do free up other things. So if you dropped below 1080p, I tell you, the graphics do kind of suck, by the way, and Cyberpunk will drop way down. Okay, I've done some experimenting with that, but the graphics get far worse once you start dropping below 1080p resolution. And gamers, for gaming, they mostly use 1080p anyways, okay? Not too often gamers are using 2 and 4K because they usually don't have systems powerful enough to actually be able to utilize that power properly and efficiently for the game to be able to be played still correctly. But then again, there are some gamers that are pretty serious and they've porked out literally thousands and thousands of dollars onto a laptop or a desktop that could actually run a 4K display without any hassle. But to go beyond 4K on a PC, you have to go to TV sets after that because there is no displays that are produced currently for Windows computers that are beyond 4K. So that's something to consider there as well. All right, you're on a TV. And on a TV, gaming is still great, but anything that's non-gaming is going to look ugly as hell, okay? That's why you need a real display for doing stuff on, you know, anything serious. But anyhow, that's what I got for you guys on this one. So comments down below as per usual. Ask your questions. Do the best I can to answer them. Stay tuned for more, and we will be sure to catch you on the next video. So see ya.